Well, welcome everybody. Hello, my name is Philip Steenkamp. I'm the president of Royal Roads University, and I'm going to be your host today. So nice to have folks joining us from different places. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yabome Gilpin-Jackson, today's Black History Month keynote speaker, and I will be introducing her more fully in a moment. I'd also like to welcome and share my thanks to Head of Human Rights and Accessibility, Alejandro Campos Garcia, who organized today's event, which I know many of you have been looking forward to, as have I. And I just, again, want to extend a big warm welcome to everybody who's joining us in this virtual room today. Before we get started, of course, we like to start all of our meetings and engagements in a good way here at Royal Roads University. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that our Langford and Colwood campuses are located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees, and Esquimalt nations. And it is indeed with great gratitude that we live, work, and learn here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. And it is indeed a beautiful sunny day here in Victoria. Just a little chilly, but some hints of spring out here as well. Before we get into today's program, though, just a few housekeeping items. For those of you online, your microphones have been muted, so feel free to ask questions using the chat. Alejandro will read them out during the Q&A portion of the program. And of course, feel welcome to leave your cameras on or off, although it's always nice to see some faces, particularly when you are making a presentation. So Black History Month is a very special time at Royal Roads University as we join people across Canada in recognizing and celebrating the contributions of Black communities, including here at Royal Roads. And this year, we invited Black students at Royal Roads to share their reflections on what it means to be Black in Canada. And they speak on themes of identity, inclusion, belonging, and much more. And you'll find the link to that video on our Black History Month webpage, which as well is posted in the chat. So I really encourage you to have a look at that if you haven't had a chance yet. It's a very, very inspiring video. There you'll also find the Royal Roads University Library's digital display, which showcases works by Black creators covering Black Canadian history, contemporary experiences, culture, post-secondary life, women in leadership, film and fiction, and much more. Now, today's event, which is being recorded, will also be available there in the days ahead. So look out for that. And if you have colleagues who are not able to join us today, please let them know that the recording is available too. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yabome Gilpin-Jackson. She's a multi-award winning scholar practitioner in human and organization development. This work, she says, is concerned with how humans organize themselves to achieve positive experiences and outcomes. Dr. Gilpin-Jackson has held executive leadership roles within the British Columbia public sector, including with the British Columbia Lottery Corporation, Fraser Health, and Vancouver Coastal Health. She is currently Simon Fraser University's first Vice President, People, Equity, and Inclusion. In addition, she is a writer and a storyteller committed to imagining and leading the futures we want. In 2021, she was runner-up Woman of the Year, Equity and Inclusion Champion by BC Business Magazine, and in the 2022 Top 100 Black Women to Watch. Dr. Gilpin-Jackson is an African-Canadian who was born in Germany, grew up in Sierra Leone, and completed her studies in Canada and the US. And she says, her upbringing and lived experiences shaped her global African identity. She has too many degrees to mention here, but I would like to mention one academic credential in particular, and that is she is a Royal Roads University alum. She has a grad certificate, I believe, in executive coaching. And I know, Dr. Gilpin-Jackson, that You have, for a long time, been friends with Dr. Zoe McLeod, who is Dean here of Partnerships and Professional Learning. So with that, I'd just like to extend a huge, warm Royal Roads welcome to you, Dr. Gilpin-Jackson. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today, and happy Black History Month. And I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction and indeed for noting that I am a Royal Roads alum, and you did get it right. I am an alum of the Executive Certificate, the Executive Certificate in Coaching, the Executive Coaching Certificate. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to sit in circle, telling stories and talking about my life, our lives, and thinking about how we be human together. And really, in this circle, there's 52 of us here. That is certainly what I'm hoping to do today. So please hear the stories and concepts and ideas and issues that I share from that perspective of just being together and learning together. I'm thinking of this conversation as one about Black legacies in Canada and in the economy, in the academy, not the economy, the academy. The economy is a question for another day. And to do that, my hope today is to take a look at the past, take a look at where we are today, and gaze together into the future. And of course, we can only do that in snapshots. There's a long storyline, past, present, and the future that we are a part of. So I offer some ways to start that inquiry, that provocation for us here today. I too would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories. Specifically, today I'm located on the territories of the Kwantlen and the Katzie peoples. And because we're gathered virtually, I do want to acknowledge that we are gathered here virtually in British Columbia, that is home to over 200 First Nations and Indigenous peoples, including our Inuit and Métis communities. And I also particularly want to highlight, given this is a Black History Month conversation, the tremendous Afro-Indigenous communities that are often unacknowledged and experiencing an additional particular form of feeling erased and being erased in our Canadian societies. I'm grateful for the work of Dr. Wilson and others at Wilfrid Laurier University that are currently documenting Afro-Indigenous communities and the long history that Indigenous peoples in Canada have with African Canadians that goes as far back as 400 years from the origins of Africans being brought to Canada through forced passageways and enslavement, and subsequently through the continued displacement of African and Black communities in the diaspora. There continues to be a long history of collaboration and integration of African and Indigenous communities, and for that I'm very grateful. We see that even today in British Columbia in the joint work that is happening between Indigenous communities and the African Canadian, Black Canadian communities that are working on Hogan's Alley here in BC. So it's important for me to note that. I'll skip that slide. You already know who I am, and you can see me on the screen. And we'll go right into then the remarks I wanted to make, starting with going back to the future. and seeing how we came to be where we are today. Just a comment I wanted to make, though, about this moment that we find ourselves in, and how I am stepping into this conversation. And for me, this is a moment where I'm bringing my lens on human development. I'm bringing my lens as has been mentioned, as a global African. But for me, also noticing, as we all no doubt are, that we're in a moment of great polarization and politicization of identities, and very much so Black identities. And for me, this has been a moment of individual and collective reflection, but it's also been a moment of a lot of clarity in what I call this time of interregnum, this gray zone change, where one system as we know it is ending or has ended. And we're in this messy middle as we collectively, as a human community, try to make sense of where we're going. For me, this moment has been incredibly clarifying, because it has reinforced all things that I love and the background that I bring in human development, and the fact that for me, we must engage each other's as equal humans with unconditional positive regard. And when we don't, we end up with the social pathologies that we're dealing with today. So for me, when I speak from a place of framing issues of identity and belonging, certainly for Black Canadians and peoples of African descent, but for all people, from a place of dignity and human rights, and from a place that I hold that human rights for all people are non-negotiable, and certainly for Black Canadians and peoples of African descent. I enter this conversation knowing that the rights and dignity of the communities that I represent are non-negotiable. And however that is landing today in society, however that is politicized, etc., so be it. But at the same time, this is a time for me to be and to speak and exist without apology, and to remind all of us that all of us must equally do so. So, with that said, stepping back for a moment, this is also a moment where we're recognizing in Canada 30 years of the recognition of Black History Month. Of course, 400 plus years of community here in Canada, but 30 years in which we've been recognizing Black History Month. And our theme this year is honoring Black brilliance across generations, which is partly the inspiration for me in terms of looking at the storyline that we're sitting in now. So it's been 30 years. For me, the question is, now what? And to answer now what, I evoke what the Honorable Maurice Sinclair, who became an ancestor last year, but left us with an incredible legacy, thinking about truth and reconciliation in Canada and our Indigenous communities. But also in the book that Maurice Sinclair wrote just before his passing, he talked about 4 questions from the Indigenous tradition that matter for life and for all Canadians to be thinking about, which are the questions: where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? What I loved about those questions and why they deeply resonated with me is also because in my scholarship, I have written about 3 questions that I believe Black communities in particular need to navigate in order to be on their own transformation journey and developmental journey in the context of the kinds of historical barriers that Black Canadians face. And those 3 questions were: who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my call? So a significant overlap in terms of thinking about developmental trajectories and what matters in terms of thinking about self-identity and self-location, especially in societies where it feels like those identities are negated and are marginalized in society. So with that context and holding those questions and thinking about that, let's step into a little bit into the past to understand how we get to a place where it's important that the self-identity of Black Canadians must be reinforced and must be celebrated. And of course, I cannot step into any question about the past as we honor also 30 years of Black History Month without Jean Augustine's words. Jean Augustine, of course, is who made it possible with her motion to celebrate Black History Month in Canada to Parliament. Is who made it possible for us to be framing these conversations today in this way. Jean Augustine often says, and I've heard her say this, I've heard her speak multiple times, I've been in conversation with her, and she will often reinforce, Black history is Canadian history. So for everything that you're about to hear, remember that this is our collective history. This is not just the history of Black Canadians. And so to do this, I thought I would put in front of you a bit of a storyline. It is only a snapshot. And of course, I have filtered it through particular pieces that I wanted to highlight. And so we have a timeline here that starts in the 1600s, start in 1608, and brings us to today and looking into the future. And as you look at this storyline, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to highlight some things for you. The first thing I want to point out is that the first recorded Black person in Canada was a free man, was a free person, meaning not enslaved, and long predating Canadian Confederacy, which of course was in 1867. The first recorded Black person in Canada was Matthew da Costa, who was recorded as being here in 1608. That is over 250 years before Canadian Confederacy. And so I point this out to dispel the myth of Black Canadians and people of African descent being new to Canada. Of course, we are newcomers, and I'm conscious of having this conversation in the context of the colonization and ongoing impacts to Indigenous Canadians who are the First Nations and rights holders here in what we call today Canada. And to note that the conversation of Black Canadians, where Black Canadians locate in the history line of newcomers is often mischaracterized. Black Canadians have been here for a very, very long time. The second thing I want to note is that the first enslaved Black Canadian recorded is Olivier de June, who was recorded in 1629. And I point this out also to dispel the myth that is often out there that enslavement wasn't an issue in Canada, and that we should be looking elsewhere for the impact of that particular issue. You can see that the first recorded enslaved person in Canada was only 6 years old. Some other highlights I would like to point out as we look at the storyline here. In the 1700s, lots of important facts that can be looked at later on by all of you in the audience. One fact I want to point out is that the first recorded race riots in what is today's North America in Turtle Island was actually recorded in Canada, in Nova Scotia, in Shelburne and Birchtown. And this was in the context of now having a society where you were beginning to have an intermingling of previously enslaved Black people that had found freedom and emancipation mixing with continually enslaved people within those communities. You had the Black loyalists who had fought in exchange for freedom in the American War for Independence, and then came over to what was still British North America when Britain lost that war. But you also had white loyalists coming up and bringing their slaves with them. And so you had this mix happening. You started to have racial tensions, and those first race riots in North America were recorded here in Canada as a result. And so in the 1800s, you had continual abolition activity. What I want to point out here is that we started to see accomplished Black leaders leading conversations about abolition, about emancipation, and these leaders also making significant impacts to Canadian society. You started to see leaders, I will name some of these later, so I won't name them now, but leaders that were starting to make significant contributions alongside pushing for emancipation. So much so that here in British Columbia, for example, we had the Black pioneers starting to come up from California. You had the group that started to come to Alberta from Oklahoma. You had, of course, out east, those that were coming and finding freedom via the Underground Railway. And those folks were settling in Ontario and Nova Scotia. So you had this growing Black community happening, and also people starting to flourish, and so much so that there started to be the pushback at the same time, and this what was called an anti-Black campaign. And I'll say more about that momentarily. But that brought us to about the 1900s. That anti-Black campaign happened. A lot of pushback that resulted ultimately in rules and laws that limited Black migration to Canada, explicit anti-Black immigration policies that started to limit the growing and the growth of Black Canadian community. And that's really important because when that happened around 1960, well, as early as the 1911, all the way to 1967, those laws started to be removed in 1967. But what we simultaneously saw was the beginning of the destruction of Black communities. So Hogan's Alley here in BC, Africville, those communities all started getting destroyed at the time that immigration laws that were systemically oppressive and limiting Black migration were overturned. So one thing changed and another one simultaneously limiting and discouraging Black community from building and flourishing as we had been doing here in Canada at that time. Of course, at the end of the 1990s, we see then this sort of resurgence in recognition, pushback for recognition of where there had been systemic discrimination, conversations about reparations, recognition of Black History Month, which brought us into the 2000s. We saw our first Black Governor General in Canada. And we have all now been living in the moments of the 2010s and 2020s that have had everything from the Black Lives Matter movement and, of course, the killing of George Floyd, which led to global movements for acknowledging and working against anti-Black racism. And now we're sitting in this moment with the anti-EDI, DEI backlash, which also includes a lot of anti-Black racism that is resurging as well. So in that storyline of note, I've noted a lot of these points here. For me, it begs the question of what's the era we're in? Are we seeing a resurgence and a slide back of these kinds of policies and rules that would limit the flourishing of Black communities? Or are we going to work together for a different kind of future that continues the trajectory of recognition and movement for Black inclusion and Black flourishing here in Canada? That's a question for all of us and one for all of us to hold. But before we leave the past, I just want to mention as well notable facts for British Columbia and notable leaders in British Columbia. Of course, Sir James Douglas is a notable leader of Caribbean heritage, Afro-Caribbean heritage, who was responsible for encouraging the Black pioneers to come up from California in 1858. And then John Jones was one of those that came up and settled in Salt Spring Island. There was a community that came and settled in Victoria and Salt Spring Island from the Black pioneers. John James is the first recorded school teacher, and that was really pushing for education and education reform here in BC. William Jones was the first recorded dentist in BC. Also arrived from that group that came from California. Mifflin Gibbs was, of course, Victoria City Councillor, and Josephine and Philip Sullivan were well-known business leaders in around what is today's Gastown. What's notable about them is their sons are recorded as being part of the group that signed the petition to form the city of Vancouver. So there you have Black leaders as founders, part of the group that are considered founders of the city of Vancouver. And of course, Joe Fortes, who was recognized for his work as the first recorded official lifeguard for the city of Vancouver. Also want to recognize in the 1900s and 2000s, Emery Burns, the first MLA in BC, Rosemary Brown, also MLA in BC, John Sullivan Dees, who had the area where that used to be called Dees Island, a very well-known businessman here in the Lower Mainland, and his history is being brought back up as we look at that area today, because Dees Island was removed as a name and as a label there in our transit system. And so that is being brought back as we speak as one of the recognitions that we're bringing back in BC. Of course, Harry Jerome, a well-known Canadian Olympian, and Valerie Jerome, who still lives in North Vancouver today. And so we have this rich past. We have this legacy now where we're starting to bring back recognition of these communities that were starting to be erased. And for me, it often begs the question, who else do we not know about? As we pull up these notables, and much gratitude to the historians and the communities that are doing this work, but who else don't we know about? And what else is hidden about Black communities and their contributions to Canada? And what about in the academy? Where is the overlap, and what are the things that we need to pay attention to as notable about the academy? So this second storyline, with this, I will again just point out a few things of note from the academic lens and things that we need to be thinking about. The first being that there were learning institutions around the world before what is modern day universities. But modern day universities certainly were built on the tradition of European institutions that were designed specifically for nobility who were at the time white men, and the children of white men who were being educated to continue building the trajectory of the legacies that they were inheriting. What became known as Studio Generalia, so more generalized universities as we know them today, started in and around later on that, but were built on that tradition and expanded across Europe in order to expand knowledge. Expand knowledge because as economies were growing, knowledge needed to be spread beyond the small group of people, and also monastery leaders, cathedral schools. There needed to be a spreading of knowledge. And so that expansion started happening beyond religious doctrines and orthodoxies and elite schools, and the embracing of scientific traditions. That all happened in the 1500 and the 1600s. Of note, the first recorded woman to earn a PhD was in 1678 in Italy. So that's how recent it was, for example, that women became a part of the academy. Of course, in the 1800s, with abolition, emancipation, and global colonization, that opened up the academy. My family is from Freetown, Sierra Leone. The first Western university south of the Sahara was in Freetown and was built there because that was the colony where freed and repatriated previously enslaved people were taken. And so you had a community of peoples of African descent that had also Western exposure, that also spoke English, and therefore the first university was founded there. And then we carry on into the 1900s. This is a time of great segregation, desegregation, coinciding, as you will note from the previous timeline, with that time of where Black communities were flourishing and also being pushed back, right? Which brings us again to today. When you look at these two storylines, you see certainly that overlap where we have push and pull between Black inclusion in the academy and in society, where we're building legacies and we're also seeing systemic erasures happening. Some people of note that I certainly didn't know about until I started looking into these is you have folks like Robert Sullivan, who was a Queen's alum, a Queen's University alum, was the first known graduate student of color in Canada, and British Columbia's and British North America's first known Black lawyer. What is also not known about Robert Sullivan, and you'll find today on the Queen's website, is that he left his inheritance to Queen's University at a time where Queen's had lost its entire endowment because of a bank collapse. So is literally credited with saving the Queen's University as we know it today. There are folks like Clement Lagore, who was one of the first doctors and also a humanitarian hero in the Halifax area. Clement Lagore was the first doctor in Nova Scotia, was denied entry into the military, was denied access to practicing after graduation, so founded his own hospital, the Amanda Hospital, and became known after an explosion in Halifax in 1917 for his response in treating hundreds of patients at that very Amanda Hospital, which was founded because of racial exclusions in the first place. And so there's these stories. These are only two. There's so many more stories where these come from. I want to note in my own life and in my own storyline, my father is an alum of the University of Alberta and has both a master's and PhD from the U of A in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And a story I like to tell was talking to a colleague at Alberta that was talking about mapping Black history at U of A and looking for Black students who have been there and etc. And I kind of offhand said, yeah, my dad went to U of A. And this colleague said, "Oh, what's your dad's name?" And I told them, and they were like, "Never heard that name. That is not one of the names we have surfaced." And so I say this because that gives you a sense of, when today we're talking about things like collecting race-based data and making sure we know in a disaggregated sense who our communities are and where they are. It is also for Black communities and Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities. It is also a matter of recording our histories. Because without that data, how would they know to have found my father in the database and all the other potential Black alum that have existed at that university and other universities that are not on record? And so the storyline of, we don't have enough Black graduate students for this policy, or we don't have enough students for that policy, or, Black history hasn't existed here continues, when it is in fact not necessarily the truth. And so here we are today. The current situation is improving, but we have a long way to go. And whether it's improving, of course, is a matter of debate, depending on what angle you're looking at it from. But here's the last storyline I will share as we move towards closing my remarks. Roughly in the last 10 years in Canada, here are some milestones that you need to know about. There was a UN working group that documented significant systemic anti-Black racism in Canada in 2017. That report exists and it's online, and made significant, decisive recommendations asking Canada to look at anti-Black racism and make changes. Canada, of course, formally adopted the United Nations International Decade for Peoples of African Descent, the first decade, which has ended, and we have endorsed in 2015 the ongoing recognition. You've had moments like the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's apology for its role in demolishing Hogan's Alley. We have had recognition of the overrepresentation of Black Canadians in the criminal justice system, and ongoing work around reform in that regard. We have had recognition of the number 2 battalion in our national defense who experienced anti-Black racism and were not recognized for a very long time. And these moments, again, that have been moments of looking towards the future, looking at restoring relationships with the Black Canadian communities. We've had recognition of the Black Nova Scotia's community and the fail in the promise to give them land and a start in life, for example, with the Black loyalists who came to Nova Scotia. And it was because that community did not receive in Canada the promise that they were given for fighting in exchange for freedom, that community, again, some of that community left and went to, again, Freetown, Sierra Leone, where my family is from. Of course, some of that community remains and continues and is a significant part of the Black Canadian story. So there's been even more recent stories over the last sort of 3 years. There was a story here in BC reporting on the experience of Black Canadians in BC. There's also ongoing research that's done by Environics and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation that shows continued impacts like Black communities being overrepresented in the criminal justice system, despite being 1 to 2% of the Canadian population, being 5% target of street checks, and constituting 9% of incarcerated persons in our systems. There are impacts to experience. You have Black Canadians, newcomers in the last few years, both those born in other provinces and those born in other countries who do not feel welcomed and included in BC specifically. And interesting, a survey by Environics showed that not only do Black Canadians say this about their inclusion experience, non-Black Canadians also recognize that they don't believe that Black Canadians are supported and experience inclusion here in Canada. There are continued barriers to employment, where you have 77.9, almost 78% Black underrepresentation in leadership. And yet you have this phenomenon of Black Canadians being overqualified and rejected, though qualified, by 50%. If you look at the last Stats Canada, you'll see that Black Canadians are well educated. And so there's this question about what's the difference between being qualified and access to employment. There's continued health inequities. There's ongoing discrimination in our schools and in our universities. I have been part of projects like the Unmasking Academia Experiences of Racialized Women that I had the pleasure of writing the intro for, after reading story after story about the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women in the academy, and experiences of exclusion and lack of support. And various dialogues that have happened have been published recently in Atlantis, for example, in that journal. And certainly as a mother of 3 children that have gone through the BC school system, I can tell you that all 3 of my children have come home having been called the N-word in schools, having had to be apologized to by students, having had to go and speak to teachers and principals in our schools continuously. This started with my eldest in kindergarten when she came home and asked me, "Mom, what do I respond when people ask me where I'm from?" This is from my BC-born daughter. And a note that the where you're from question happens with newcomers, and it happens with generational Black Canadians. So it's again the ongoing narrative of, do you belong here? So it's not the issue of trying to find out people's identity, which I always say, if you are really in relationship with folks, you're going to hear those stories anyway. It is the stranger interaction and the insinuation in the context of when the "where are you from" question is asked. That is the issue. So this is not me saying never ask someone where they're from when it's appropriate at your conferences and elsewhere. Be in relationship and let relationship go before the question. But being aware that, again, Black Canadians, there's a whole project that CBC did a few years ago about generational, 8th-generation Canadians and newcomers all contending with this question of belonging, anchored on the question of being asked, where are you from, consistently. All of these things have impacted civic engagement. Earlier, I talked about and named Emery Burns and named Rosemary Brown. It's interesting to note that the 3rd and 4th MLAs in British Columbia were only elected in 2024. MLA Rian Gaspar from Abbotsford, who was elected in 2024, along with MLA George Anderson from Nanaimo. They were both elected at the same time. And they are only the 3rd and 4th after a huge span of no Black representation in our legislature. And that, of course, comes with these experiences of inclusion, exclusion, and lack of representation in our civic engagement. Same in housing. In BC, Black Canadians being overrepresented in the unhoused population. And media representation has also had impacts. 60% of survey respondents, and again, this could be Black and non-Black folks in BC, saying that Black identities are poorly represented in pop culture. Again, when I have a child come home after some video showing at school and say to me, Mom, I no longer want to be Black or African, because every time they show videos in school, the Black and African kids look bad. That gives you a signal of how much this impacts our children and our communities and Black Canadians. So I'm grateful for today's griots. I'm grateful for folks like Afua Cooper, who was through whose speaking and history and work in Black history, I found out, for example, about the Sullivans being signatories to the petition for the city of Vancouver. Folks like the BC Black History Society and the team there, Sylvia and others that are documenting BC Black history, the Canadian Black Scientists Network, the Black Cultural Centre in Nova Scotia, the organization like 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women. For everybody I named, you now have organizations that are documenting hundreds of Black women and others that are making significant contributions here in Canada. So the question is, where do we go from here? We have 30 years of recognizing Black history. We have 400 plus years of history and contributions. Where do we go from here, and where do we go in the academy? In the academy, of course, you have this initiative with the Scarborough Charter. I'm proud in my SFU hat that we are signatories to this initiative that is documenting and working to ensure Black inclusion in the academy under the conditions of everything I just described. These, of course, get replicated in the academy, these impacts. The Scarborough Charter has, for example, documented 10 accomplishments that are promising practices, that are things that are advancing Black inclusion in the academy. In its report last year, we will have the pleasure here at SFU of hosting Dr. Wisdom Teti, who's Philip's colleague at Carleton, who was also the initiator of the Scarborough Charter. We'll be hosting him in conversation tomorrow. And through the Scarborough Charter, here are some things that we have done that Royal Roads could also look to. That report is also online, so I'd leave it there. And we have been building on that work of being signatories and our commitments. I'm also proud that this week we are opening. It has opened, but we are officially opening a Black Student Center. As a student that came to SFU in 1999 and barely saw 3 other students that looked like me walking around campus, and went through classes and would have one other Black student in most of my classes. It's such a joy to see how far we've come, and I know there's a ways to go. But these are not just symbolic. They're about changing these narratives that you've heard me talk about today. They're about making people feel welcome. They're about making sure that students can learn. They're about students' outcomes, that they can learn, that they can bring their own lived experiences, that they can bring their own histories and be recognized and do well in terms of academic outcomes, and therefore in terms of serving our community, whether in the private sector, public sector, or otherwise. So if Black history is Canadian history, where do we go from here? And my question that I'll leave us with is, when future generations look back, what legacy will you have left individually? And would we have left in our institutions? For you at Royal Roads, for me at SFU, and in all the public spaces that I've served, what is the legacy that we're going to leave in this place? What will future generations say? Will they find themselves more easily in our history? Will they be able to refute narratives that say Black Canadians are not part of the Canadian story? For me, my wish has always been that we arrive at a future where affirming, recalling, responding, appreciating, and recognizing Black Canadians is normalized, so that we can all just be. We can be human together. As Toni Morrison said, and I love this quote, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. Thank you.
Wow. Dr. Gilpin-Jackson, thank you so much. That was an extraordinary overview. I loved your comments at the beginning about the four guiding questions from the late Murray Sinclair. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? I think you covered that in an extraordinary way. And I personally learned so much about Black history in Canada. I knew pieces of it, but you wove it together in such a rich and remarkable way. And I think left us with a challenge too. I know we have about 10 minutes here, so I'm going to ask folks if they have any questions. So we're going to begin the audience questions now. And as a reminder, if you could please pop any questions you have in the chat, and Alejandro will read those out. And I'm going to turn this over to Alejandro right now, if we've got anything to start with. I'm sure people are processing a huge amount of information. I've got lots of questions, but I think I'd prefer to turn it over to the community now. Alejandro, please.
Yeah, there is no questions in the chat so far. I saw that Lisa raised her hand. I don't know if Lisa is ready to ask the question directly.
Please.
Yes, sorry. Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. First off, I would like to say thank you so much for such a wonderful and detailed presentation. I appreciated that you included in the welcome land acknowledgement, Black, Indigenous, and Black peoples being brought to Canada willingly or unwillingly, and the experiences of those who have been here before Canada was Canada. So I appreciate that. Also, I wanted to acknowledge the amount of information that you shared and how detailed it was. It's appreciated that you shared so much of Canadian history in your presentation. And I can speak as a Black Canadian of Caribbean descent, that a lot of what you spoke to has applied to me as well. And I wanted to say that I, in kindergarten, was called the N-word. I can also say that I've been told to go back to my own country. I can say that as a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, I've been told that I'm not a real Canadian while in uniform. So I wanted to say thank you so much for identifying all of these things, because as a Black Canadian, especially one that was born in Canada, these stories need to be told and shared, and you did an amazing job sharing them today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alejandro, I see Monique has her hand up as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I'm echoing similar sentiments to Lisa. When people tell me, representation doesn't matter, that we're all just part of the human race, I feel like these are poignant times that I can leverage in terms of that transparency of being seen explicitly. And when you share your stories, both personal and then to align it with the academic arena, we're not left out in it. You carried us with you throughout. And I think there's a beauty in that. I've been afforded a variety of different spaces where I've heard speakers, but you so beautifully and eloquently interwove not just your own personal lived experience, but you were able to see us as a collective in our humanness. And so thank you for that. That was a long-winded comment. But yeah, like, oh my goodness, sorry. And all of my lived experience, this has just been so enriching and so informed. I do DEI, but I capture it as inclusion. I capture it as cultural intelligence with emotional intelligence, because I feel like you can't separate the two when we're speaking to it. And so I'm doing a master's in leadership at Royal Roads University, and the journey to this point in terms of even discovering that I can identify myself has been a journey and a half. So to recognize that there has been leaders, and one of my favorite books is They Came Before Columbus. And so that was really my leverage point of understanding that our history was vastly more. And this is the last thing I'll say. In grade 7, Mr. Woodley's class, I don't think he'll mind me naming him, I once asked, when we were doing our series on Black history, Canadian Black history, because my dad's Nova Scotian, my mom's Jamaican, and I asked the question, was enslavement the beginning of Black history, or was it an interruption? And I will never forget his face to that day, but what he afforded me over time was access to all that he had access to. And so, again, thank you for exactly, unequivocally, with not any slight changes to how you showcased your information. I appreciate you sincerely.
Thank you.
Alejandro, any comments, questions, more questions?
No comments or questions.
And while waiting, just to acknowledge both of you, thank you for adding to my words and sharing your experiences. It's always a bit daunting. Black community and people's Africans, people of African descent, and Black community is so diverse that often it's really difficult to try and capture that while drawing that underlying through line and the connections between all these communities. And so I really appreciate both of you naming that you could see and hear yourself in the storyline I shared. Deeply appreciate it. It's a difficult task. Yeah. Thank you. Not to mention Afro Latino communities that are often left out of this conversation that are the largest Black diaspora outside of the African continent. When we sit in Turtle Island, North America, we often forget that community, but even the UN recognizes them as the largest African community, African descent community outside of the continent of Africa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gilpin-Jackson. I know we are at time, but I just want to thank you for sharing with us today and for being in conversation with us too. I think you have a sense of how much the community here appreciates your time and what you've had to share with us today. And I was really sort of struck as well by, I'm very close colleagues with Dr. Wisdom Tete. We were just in India for 10 days together as well, and I am talking to him tonight too, and really struck with the challenges universities face right now in the context of the backlash against EDI and the way in which that is supercharging anti-Black racism again. And we have a real responsibility, I think, as leaders in these organizations to really think about how we support Black students and Black staff and Black scholars as we move forward. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday, Black woman talking about how she changed the name on her CV because she has an African-sounding name. And when she changed the name, the number of responses increased by 100%. Just an extraordinary thing. And that's happening right now, right?
Absolutely.
People highly qualified and highly educated. And it just struck me again today as you were talking about the ongoing challenges, that there's a lot of work to do. But understanding where we've come from and where we've been and where we are going, I think you sort of laid that out in a brilliant way for us. I just, again, want to thank you so much for being here today. I want to thank the community for joining us. I want to thank Alejandro, of course, for organizing the event, and our communications and media services team for all of their support. So with that, I will wish everybody a very good afternoon. And in particular, Dr. Gilpin-Jackson, extend our thanks to you for joining our community. Thank you so much. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Goodbye.